This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
Indylive.radio. Hello, good evening and welcome to the TNT show. You know, it's been a great day for UK democracy. Hey, an unelected bureaucrat just gave a press conference in what might be a constitutional first. Happily, our guest tonight can probably enlighten us to whether it's a first and what change it's made to the UK democracy and the UK constitution. My name is John Drummond and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our special guest this evening, I'm really excited that he's able to join us, and it's a first for TNT. This is an interview to an overseas location, so anything could happen, but let's hope things go smoothly. But first, a few words about TNT. TNT, as regular folks who join us will know, stands for The Nation Talks. So, as I often say, in many respects, this is your show. Thanks for your advanced questions, and do remember to send your questions live during the show. And you can contact 07507 248 836 or email john@cleach.com. However you contact us is fine. We'd love to have your questions. My Sunday National column at the weekend, you may recall if you've got a chance to look at it, challenged the BBC to come on this show to explain why people in Scotland should trust their coverage here. So far, no response. I guess they're still cowering in their Pacific Key. But the offer remains on the table. Now, to our guest this evening, Dr Elliot Bulmer. No one, I guarantee you this, no one knows more about constitutions than Elliot. Indeed, he's written the book on constitutions. And if truth be told, 3 books. Elliot is a former submarine officer, and he's also served in Basra. Elliot, how are you coping with COVID-19 virus?
Hi, John. Good to speak to you. All well. Everything, pretty much under control here. I'm speaking to you from The Hague in the Netherlands. And, there's a famous poem that has a line, it's about the Battle of the Medway, and it has a line about this the Dutchmen know. And it recounts all the failures and corruptions and misadventures of the British state under Charles II and contrasts them with the generally businesslike and statesmanlike operations of the Dutch. And I think you could make quite a similar parallel today, that the Dutch government has approached the situation without the same sort of bluster and incompetence that we've seen from the British government. There's been some careful planning. I mean, this is a country that exists by dint of long-term contingency planning. That's how they keep the water out.
I had lots of clients in the Netherlands, and they had a favourite, I wouldn't say it was a joke, it's an aphorism, a saying, in which they claimed that God made the world in 6 days, but the Dutch made Holland. I guess what they were trying to say is that there wasn't much of Holland before they started.
Well, that's true. I mean, if you go back, it was basically some silted up rivers, and they reclaimed the land. So I think they have a skill. This is a country, it's very fascinating to look at the metaphors people use. And in Britain, most of the metaphors around politics are either sporting metaphors or metaphors of war. Whereas here they talk about politics as negotiation, politics as compromise, and politics as work, right? It's serious, sensible business. So the whole mentality and approach is quite different. And that filters through then to the fact that the healthcare system here has not been overwhelmed. Supply chains have not been overwhelmed. And while obviously it's still a very tragic situation, there hasn't been that evidence of mismanagement that we've perhaps seen elsewhere.
I was always reminded of the term they used to describe Dutch culture. They called it poldermodel. This notion that you could only recover land by creating dikes, i.e. polders, in which you enclose the water and then pumped it all out. And the poldermodel concept was based on the notion that it didn't matter where you were in building the polder, either at the top of the dike or the bottom. The fact of the matter is that everyone's contribution was important. So it was about a communitarian view of life, not an elitist view. I'm not sure if that still holds, because that was some years ago.
I think it's been strange. but I think it's so deeply entrenched in the culture here. So the water boards that manage the dikes and the dams are some of the oldest democratic institutions still in existence, going right back to the early Middle Ages, with an unbroken existence.
Well, and talk a little bit about you, about your background, and do include the submarines, please.
Okay, so I mean, the background is you want me to start with my schooling? I mean, I went to a school which had scrawled in graffiti over the gates, "Tory school for Tory kids." It was it was an independent school which had a certain reputation for being. It has produced several Conservative MPs, as well as, to be fair, several notable MPs from other parties. And so that was my background in terms of the early schooling. But you know, it's really interesting. We'll get onto the subject that I'm going to talk about tonight. So I did my A levels, higher equivalents, and I was set an essay question by my politics teacher, which was, should the UK Constitution be reformed, and if so, how? And I feel as if I've been answering that question on and off for several decades now. So the trajectory that I have followed, the interests that I've done, my academic pursuits have all stemmed really from seeds that were sown in my teens around understanding systems of government, right? So I remember on one occasion, around the same time, I would have been about 16. I'm sure I should have been doing other things as a 16-year-old, but those options were never presented to me at the time. I encountered the French Constitutional Charter of 1814, and I saw in that a system of government, a structure of government reduced to written form. And I found it a thing of beauty and of elegance, in the way that some people talk about, you know, mathematicians talk about mathematical equations as having an elegance. And so that's where my interest in constitutions actually started. From there, came back to Scotland for undergraduate at Edinburgh University, studied Arabic and politics, always had an interest in sort of the Middle East and wanted to do a language, so I did Arabic. When people asked me why I did Arabic, I would reply with all the cockiness of an undergraduate, oil and war, boy, oil and war. And so it turned out, right? So I graduated, joined the Royal Navy, which seemed like a very natural sort of career progression for me at that point. I joined the Royal Navy and was sent off to Iraq, initially as a sort of military interpreter, and I ended up doing some very interesting things in Iraq, by the end of which time I had become thoroughly disillusioned in many ways with the way in which the politics of the situation were unfolding. I felt the position there was untenable and morally difficult to justify. And so that put in chain a sort of a set of events that led to my leaving the Navy.
Just before you do that,
yeah,
we've had some questions about submarines. People are very much interested in bodily functions, and the notions, the questions are going. People are asking, does it smell in a submarine?
Not so you'd notice.
Really?
Yeah, because you're all living it together, right? So you've got like 130 guys, all sweating and stinking. Very few showers, limited access to fresh water, limited laundry facilities, recirculated air, but it's all so fetid that you almost don't notice it.
Really? It sounds a bit like my last EasyJet flight. Anyway, or maybe it was Ryanair. I'm not quite sure. You get used to it, do you? You get used to the smell? You just...
I guess, I mean, I didn't enjoy submarines, right? It's something that I had wanted to do. And I volunteered for submarines. I always thought there was something quite fascinating about it. But I actually found, somewhat to my surprise, that I found that the environment very socially claustrophobic. So you're constantly surrounded by other people. And you have no solitude at all. And as someone who is quite bookish and reflective by nature, I found that really psychologically very difficult.
Yeah. So you were up to the point where you left the Navy because you were disillusioned.
So I left the Navy to do a PhD at Glasgow. Now, I should say that by this point, sitting in a tent in Basra, dodging Scud missiles at one point, I asked myself a series of questions, and they're the Tony Benn questions around, what power do you have? Who gave it to you? How are you accountable? How do we get rid of you? Those kinds of questions around the Iraq War. How was that decision made? Who made it? How did they make it? How are they held accountable? How can we get rid of them? And so really it was at that point that my earlier interest in constitutions, which I had alluded to, was reignited. And I decided to go and do a PhD at Glasgow University looking at constitutional design. And really this question of, my starting question was really, why do constitutions look as they do? And what do constitutions do? And it was from there that I really started getting into the sort of academic side of the study of constitutions.
When you say you got into the academic side of it, you mean, is that when you first had a thought about writing a book about it, or did that come much later?
No, the idea of writing a book about it really started long before that. I think I've always seen myself as a writer. I've always had a sort of desire and an urge to write. And I actually first started writing about constitutions even as an undergraduate. None of that stuff is published or publishable, of course. But the ideas that were later to germinate in my PhD and afterwards go back well before then.
Okay. So, taking it as most basic, if you were to bump into somebody who they asked you what you did and you talked about constitutions, and they said, so what is a constitution? This is much more likely to come from somebody from this country, where there isn't a great tradition about constitutions. It's unlikely you get that question from elsewhere. But if that was the question that was posed, how would you describe a constitution to someone who had no understanding or background of it?
Okay, so I would say it's the basic ground rules of the state, right? So it's normally, most countries have a document that is called the Constitution, that is a legal document, but it is not only a legal document, it is also a political document and a social document that sets out certain principles, values, institutions, and processes of government. So it's like a handbook. If we have constitutions in almost every area of life, even in a UK setting. So if you go to your local tennis club or bridge club or something, it will have a constitution. And so we're familiar with the concept that we set things down, we state what our aims are, what our purposes are, what our terms of membership are. And most countries do that to the state as well, because the state belongs to its people, right? There is a sense in which the whole community of the realm, to use the terms from the Declaration of Arbroath, have a kind of common ownership of the state. And the Constitution is the terms by which the citizens manage and control the state. For those who are watching rather than listening, I think it's really helpful just to sort of pick up a constitution, and so people can see the kind of thing that I'm talking about. This is the Constitution of Fiji. For those who are just listening, it's a small book. It fits into the palm of my hand. It's about a centimeter thick, perhaps. And this is what you would find in most countries that have a constitution. It would be something like that. The United Kingdom is very rare, not quite unique, but almost, in not having such a document. So some people talk about the British Constitution as an unwritten constitution, or if they are unforgivably pedantic, an uncodified constitution, just means it's not organized into like a code, into one document. But in the practical functional terms in which I study constitutions, the United Kingdom does not have a constitution in that sense. It does not have a supreme and fundamental law that establishes and regulates the state.
I mean, there must be a reason for this. What are the advantages of having no written constitution?
If you're the government, it gives you a great deal of freedom of action, because you can make up the rules as you go along, and you can't be held accountable for changing those rules or prevented from changing them to suit your own immediate interests. So that's hugely advantageous if you happen to be in power.
There are no constraints on any British government that has a majority. Is that the case?
I mean, obviously there are external constraints, right? I mean, and there are constraints that are imposed by things like the financial markets, and there may be soft constraints that are limited by things like public opinion, like you would find in any even sort of despotic state. But there are no legally enforceable rules that are protected from manipulation to suit the short-term immediate interests of the government if the government has a parliamentary majority. It can change the rules at will. So in most countries, there are two sets of rules, right? So you have the ordinary rules about, how education policy works, or speed limits, or whatever it might be. And those are amendable by ordinary legislation. And then you have the constitutional rules that are in a document like the Constitution, which can be changed and can be amended, but it can't be done easily or unilaterally by the government with an ordinary working majority. There has to be some sort of wider process to show some sort of settled will, some sort of consensus around changing those fundamentals. So that if you want to change those things in light of changing circumstances or experience, you can do so, but you have to actually convince people. You have to build a consensus around that. The government can't just do it by fiat for its own purposes.
I mean, some people say to me, well, actually, it's not such a bad thing to have no written constitution, because look at the United States, what a mess there is there. And they've had a written constitution for centuries. What would you say to that?
Yeah, that's a commonly heard point, right? And often they'll point to something like the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms. But I think it's worth pointing out that the United States Constitution is an incredibly unusual constitution, right? Most countries don't have a constitution like the US Constitution. And nobody is proposing a constitution like the US Constitution in a Scottish or British context. That's the first point. The second point is that it is in some ways the Model T Ford of constitutions, right? It's not quite the first. It's certainly not the best, but it was the one that sort of made it mainstream. So there are many problems with the US Constitution, just like there are many problems with the Model T Ford. The Model T Ford couldn't go up steep hills because it had a gravity-fed fuel feed. But that's not a reason not to have a car. It was a particular set of design flaws, which there are in the US Constitution. But actually, we've learned quite a lot over the last 250 years about how to write good constitutions. Most of which, by the way, has come from the British, right? So the most radical constitutional innovator in the period from, say, 1945 to 1980 was the British Colonial Office and its successors. Some of the finest constitutions in the world were written by British civil service lawyers or by people who'd been trained in the ways of British civil service lawyers. So it's not as if these things are unheard of in a British context. It was just always this assumption that those kind of rules should apply to others and never to ourselves. So in sort of arguing for a written constitution, I'm not arguing for something that's actually deeply opposed to the British tradition. I'm simply arguing that Malta or Jamaica or Fiji or the Solomon Islands or Canada could also be done closer to home. And that the fact that that hasn't happened isn't because of any innate advantage of not writing it down, other than to the government of the day, but simply because the historical opportunity has never yet arisen. Although I think we are now at that point where the previous unwritten system has become increasingly untenable. I think it was Kenyon Wright who said that that which has always been objectionable, I may be mangling the quote, but that which has always been objectionable in theory has now become untenable in practice. And I think we're at that sort of point where there were always these set of theoretical arguments, but we've reached a crisis point where the unwritten system is simply broken now. Yeah. And that creates an opportunity, but also a desperate need to reconstitute the state in some way.
Okay, we'll come back to that perhaps shortly, but the reason you're based at where you are is because you work with an organisation which actually helps countries throughout the world improve their constitutions. And it's funded partly by the Dutch government and partly by the Swedish government. And you spend a bit of your time, as I understand it, travelling the world to various places that most people regard as somewhat exotic, like Tuvalu. Have I pronounced that right? Tuvalu?
Tuvalu, yes. In the South Pacific.
So you're in the Pacific Islands, and you're in Myanmar, and you're in different interesting places, talking to people about constitutions. What's your sense of how that works? Or are you treated like, oh, here's a guy from Washington, he's come to help us?
I think it helps that we don't come from Washington, right? I mean, you mentioned the Dutch and the Swedes. We also receive funding from other countries that have a reputation for being solid democracies with a peaceful diplomatic stance. So, like, we don't have members of the Permanent Five UN Security Council members in our organization. So I think that helps. We have a reputation for neutrality and also a reputation for being non-prescriptive, right? So we don't turn up in a country and say, this is how your constitution should be. We turn up in a country and say, I see that you're having a difficulty around this issue. Here's how some other countries have solved a similar issue. And we can talk about the sort of lessons learned from that. So generally speaking, it's receptive. It depends a bit on the political context, obviously. I've worked in some contexts, like a country in the Middle East where I worked a few years ago, where the government wasn't very receptive and quite quickly closed us out of the process. But I've also worked in countries where people really do want to listen and learn and get help as they go through this, right? Because people recognize that the Constitution matters. People recognize that they've got to get this right. The Constitution itself doesn't solve policy issues. It's not a shortcut to success. It's the foundation of your system of government. And people understand that it's important to get that right. And they also recognize that this is something that is often a once in a generation, sometimes like once in a lifetime thing for that particular country. But that there are other countries around the world that are going through these changes, right? So generally speaking, people want to avoid costly mistakes. And so you don't want to reinvent the wheel. Many of the issues that have arisen have occurred elsewhere. And generally people are receptive to that. I'd like to talk a bit more about this, actually, because it's fascinating. People you meet. I was in Kenya, one of the many countries that became independent from the United Kingdom. And I was speaking to a politician there who said, in the early 1960s, we just wanted independence. And we just tried to unite everyone around the idea of getting independence, and we'd solve all the other problems afterwards. But we became independent, and we hadn't actually thought through the constitutional issues well enough. And quickly, it became a very corrupt, authoritarian one-party state. And all the promise of independence was lost. And that's a recurring story that I've heard time and time again, right? That countries want to become independent, and then they become independent, but because they haven't built a better state, they think of it simply as getting rid of something alien, not in terms of building something better themselves. They have squandered the potential advantages of independence. And sometimes things have actually regressed quite considerably. So, in a context of a country that is considering independence amongst its range of constitutional options, I would say, think very carefully about what you're doing in that case. You're not choosing a new government, you are constituting a new state. And that is a new state that has to, for all to ensure, even those who voted against independence, that new state is something that they can give their allegiance to, and that they can feel comfortable in, and that where they're proud to be citizens of that state. Because that's how you build the kind of stability that gives you the institutional solidity that then gives you your prosperity.
These are wise words. On your travels, have you come across any situations that might be akin or somewhat similar to the Scottish environment setting up?
Many. I haven't directly worked in a country that's transitioning to independence. Most of the situations that I've been involved with is a country that's already independent, that is in a process of major constitutional change. Tuvalu is fascinating, right? Because I think Tuvalu is a country of 12,000 people. I used to stay in Dunblane. It's got a population of, I don't know, about 12, 15,000. You think about that, an independent state, a member of the United Nations. It's been independent and go through a constitutional review process in which they wanted to take stock of what's been working well, what's been badly, where can we improve.
Yeah.
But in that time, they had catastrophic failure. Right? They have not slipped into autumn, and they have not slipped into, anarchy. And that's because the institutions are sound. So the difference is you can't put this on until an independence decision has been the upper stage, negotiation and planning, but institutions and foundational rules is absolutely key to the success of an independence project.
Fascinating. Let me just remind everyone that we're more than happy to take your questions. You can write to me at john@cleash.com, or you can text or contact Indylive. We're having one or two technical problems here. I seem to have disappeared from my own screen. But I can still see Elliot and I can still hear Elliot, and I hope you can too. It would be somewhat ironic if we lost a connection to Scotland, but kept it to the Netherlands.
As long as you don't do an Alex Salmond on me and suddenly mute my mic in the middle of me saying something.
Oh, no, absolutely not. I have no control over your mic, or for that matter, any other part of this process, as you probably gathered. And we're completely in the hands of the technical people. But so I shall press on, because I assume that people don't particularly need to see me anyway, but I do hope they can hear me. Tell us a little bit about what you feel the status is of the British state and the old British Empire right now. What's your analysis of where it is and where it's likely to end up?
This is actually the subject largely of my forthcoming book. I have a new book out later this year that's called Westminster and the World with Polity Press, and that looks at this question of the sort of British imperial state and how it developed, how countries transitioned to independence. And there's a lot that can be learned from those processes of transitioning to independence from former British colonies. But the British imperial state itself has never really come to terms with the end of empire. It has attempted to, but we still have essentially what I call the Hanoverian constitutional settlement. So for a period from the middle of the 1600s to the middle of the 1700s, the British imperial state was formed. And we had a series of civil wars, experimental regimes, a failed republic, a theocracy, a restored monarchy, a foreign invasion, all sorts of prolonged political constitutional instability for a century to hit upon a formula that worked. And that formula was essentially a monarchy under aristocratic control that would enable an imperial, commercial, maritime state to expand across the globe. And essentially, we're still living in the institutions and under the rule of that Hanoverian state. But its raison d'etre has ceased to be, right? So we don't have an empire anymore. That causes a sort of fundamental disequilibrium, I think, in British institutions, that the purpose for which they were designed and developed no longer exists. What we need to have is a kind of fundamental rethink of the institutions of the state. Now, clearly, in light of the claim of right, any sort of simplistic unitary understanding of the British state no longer applies. It's no longer tenable in a Scottish context. It doesn't necessarily have to be independence. I mean, there may be ways of reconstituting a state which are broadly agreed and accepted that just look fundamentally quite different from what we have today. But that would depend very much on the willingness of England and English politicians to enter into that kind of conversation, right? And to enter into a kind of post-imperial imagination. And I just don't see many signs of that right now, right? I look at the imagery and the rhetoric, and it all looks backwards, and none of it looks forwards. And these are the sort of classic symptoms, what I call dying empire syndrome. Spain really struggled with this in the 19th century. And it's rarely pretty. In these situations, the sooner a country kind of gets over it, the better. We're in a bit of a catch-22 here, because I think in order to reinvent whatever's left of the UK, or an independent Scotland, or an independent England and Wales, or whatever it might be, we can actually learn a lot from how other countries became independent from the UK. It's almost as if we have to think of not just Scotland becoming independent from the UK, but also England becoming independent from the UK. And I started this journey a long time ago, thinking at it from the perspective of like the role of Scottish nationalism in reconstituting the state. But I also think English nationalism is going to have a very key role in this, and the ability of England to become a normal nation. At the moment, it's being a very abnormal nation. And these are difficult things, right? You can't sit down and say, oh, I could draw constitutional solutions, right? But those constitutional solutions don't work unless there's the political agreement behind them. But clearly we are at a point where the British imperial state has exhausted itself.
You mean completely?
Yeah, it's exhausted. I think we're reaching a point of institutional, moral, ethical, political exhaustion, where the current system of government that was hammered out between the 1640s and the 1740s has reached the end of its life. And in order to preserve that which is good in it, and there was a lot that was good in it. I'm not one of those people who says, everything about the British state was bad. I don't think that's a mature, sensible way of proceeding. What I would say is that the good that was in it has been lost and is in danger of being further lost.
Yeah.
And the bad that was always there has come to the surface. So we see particular instances, you could add them up, right? And there's just so many. The Chilcot inquiry, the Hutton inquiry, Cash for Questions, the prorogation crisis, the complete mess of how Brexit has been handled and the divisions that has engendered. The fact that we had, a bizarre press conference by a special advisor, and on the same day had someone in the civil service tweeting, imagine having to work with these truth twisters. The whole system, the norms, the values of the institutions has been corroded, and we need to rebuild that. And either it could be rebuilt as a different type of United Kingdom, or it could be rebuilt as an independent Scottish state. And I leave it to your listeners and viewers to try and decide for themselves which they think is more likely, right? One thing I will say there is that it's much easier to constitute a new state for 5 million people than it is for 65 million people.
And particularly, as you say, there has to be an appetite. And there's clearly an appetite in Scotland, not by everyone, but by a significant, almost half the population, for constitutional change. As you said earlier, and I would agree, I don't see much of an appetite south of the border for anything remotely like what is wished for by a substantial number of people in this country.
That's right. It's a question of whether there is a sufficient appetite in England for the kind of change that would be the minimum acceptable level in Scotland. I feel that the Scottish conversation is 30 to 50 years ahead of where the English conversation is. I do think there's been a change in the English conversation. I think that I'm not seeing the same kind of blinkered loyalty to the system that there used to be, right? In previous decades, you could mount a a fairly coherent and logical conservative defense of the British system of government, and many people did. And that has become less and less convincing. I see even now that when I started doing this stuff, the idea that we should have a written constitution was just an anathema, right? It just made you almost to the point that nobody took you seriously as a scholar. Tom Paine had proposed a written constitution, but no one had dared to do so since. Now, I think it is probably still a minority position within English sort of thought, but it's no longer quite the marginal position that it was. So I do think that there is a shift and a recognition that the current system is unsustainable. But these things are done against the clock, right? So Scottish patience will not last forever. We're almost in the same sort of situation that there was around the Reformation in the middle of the 16th century, where, the desire in Scotland was not completely different from that in England. It's just the desire in Scotland was to go further and faster, and England was sort of lagging behind somewhat. Nobody knows what the outcome is going to be, right? Generally speaking, it's rare for countries to achieve independence, except in a sort of decolonization context. And incidentally, I think it makes perfect sense to frame Scottish independence as being parallel to the independence of other British territories that transitioned from London rule to some form of self-government, to extensive self-government, to independent Commonwealth realms, rather than making parallels with Catalan or Flemish nationalism or those sorts of things. It's not the same thing as that. But it's quite rare to achieve that in one step from where we are at the moment. So, I was arguing a long time ago, when they had the national conversation back in about 2009, that serious thought ought to be given to where's the next step, and a next step that would show people that Scotland is financially viable as an independent state before actually becoming an independent state. But these things then they come down to the politics of the situation, right? I mean, you can constitute different sort of arrangements to deal with pretty much anything around which there is a political agreement. But the difficulty is reaching that political. What gives the words on the page of a constitution their credibility and their viability is that they reflect a political consensus, and that it is much easier to construct a political consensus in a relatively homogeneous, unitary nation state of 5 million people than in a heterogeneous union state of 65 million people, where the perception of that trajectory may be quite different. So, but whichever way it happens, this is a constitutional problem, and it must therefore have a constitutional solution. So I'll finish there.
That's interesting. I mean, obviously, as part of the debate here, people are saying things like, well, what really ought to happen now is we ought to declare UDI because at least half the population would wish that to happen. And besides, both the Edinburgh Parliament and also the Westminster Parliament have accepted the principle of the sovereignty of the Scottish people. And why not? Now, in our discussion with Martin Keatings, he explained eloquently that it was important to have international support. What's your take on this?
I agree that it's important to have international support. It's important that the Scottish state be seen as a legitimate state. Good relations with whatever is left of the United Kingdom are paramount. I understand the psychological appeal of UDI. I can understand how people get to a point where they're just, I'm done with this now. Generally, that doesn't work out well unless you have overwhelming public backing. I don't mean 50%, 55%, 60%. I mean, you have to have very, very strong public backing, unanimity. You also have to be willing to fight for it, right? And then you have to have other states willing to recognize you, which sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. And we can't quite speculate on how that would work out. But I would be of the view that the British state has a long tradition. Like, there is nothing more in keeping with the British constitutional tradition than a managed, peaceful, democratic transition to independence. So all we need to do in that sense, if we're interested in creating an independent state, is to hold British state to its own traditions. Normally what has happened in countries transitioning to independence is they have a legislature in which a pro-independence majority is elected. They give notice to the British government that they intend to become independent, and the British government, being the jolly decent chaps that they are, make the necessary preparations, because it is understood that the association is a voluntary one and not one of compulsion. So if a sovereign Scotland is in the Union, it is so by its own will and consent. If a Scottish government, supported by a majority in the Scottish Parliament, is of the view that that consent ought to be tested by means of a referendum, then it is not the British government's business to prevent that. They have to give the legal sanction, but politically they are bound to give it. In the same way as the Queen, an act of Parliament cannot become an act of Parliament without the royal assent. But that doesn't mean that the Queen can just choose to withhold assent. She is bound to give it. So I would only ever be in favour of doing things in a lawful way, and doing things in a way which is as consensual as possible. But in order to do that, I think that the real challenge here is to Scottish Unionists. There's a complete failure of Scottish Unionist imagination. And I would ask Scottish Unionists, what sort of union would you like to see? And what are the terms of that union? And I think that could be quite a profitable conversation to have, because I've asked this question, in context where people say, "Oh, I'm against independence," but then you ask them, "Well, what sort of powers do you think should be devolved?" And actually, they're in favour of a massive shift of powers. And so you have this sort of very emotional, tenuous connection to some sort of continuing union, which could look completely different and could actually meet many of the aspirations. Yeah. As a next step, right? The question then is whether the British government will be willing to do that, and they're clearly at the moment not. But to not do that is to go against their own tradition, to go against their own norms, values, and standards. So this is where it all ties together, right? Because the traditional understanding of the union was as a union based on consent, and now what we're seeing is this very new assertion by the British government of its supposed right to deny that consent. And that's the thing that should be challenged.
I mean, that seems to me in part, at least in large part, what Martin Keatings and his group are doing. The Forward is one. They are taking that particular argument through the courts in order to establish that they have met all the criteria for another referendum. Of course, it would be down to the Scottish Parliament if it decided, if it agreed, but they want to establish that there is the right to have that, as confirmed by the courts. I take it you don't have a problem with that.
I don't have a problem with that, but I would go perhaps just a little bit further and say, well, to the Scottish Unionists, how are they thinking about this union? Are they denying that it rests on consent? If you go back to, I think Winston Churchill recognised that if Scotland returned a majority of pro-independence MPs, then it should become independent. Thatcher certainly recognised that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. But the reality is that the UK right now has a government in Westminster that is implacably opposed, not just to the core concept, but not even to any form of engagement. It has set its face against any discussion as being inappropriate.
My argument is that is symptomatic of the wider untangling of the unwritten British Constitution. this disintegration of previously accepted norms and values and institutions. So the denial of Scotland's right to self-determination through a Section 30 order or by other means, and a special advisor giving press briefings in the Rose Garden, and civil servants tweeting, what's it like to work with these truth twisters, and the prorogation crisis are all of one company. They're all part and parcel of the same thing, which is the disintegration of the institutions of the British state. And if there were to be a reconstitution of the United Kingdom, one of the things that I think should be absolutely fundamental to that, and should be a condition for Scottish participation in that discussion, is the right to secession. A recognition in a future constitution of the United Kingdom that it rests on consent and Scotland has the right to independence at a time and in a way of its own choosing. And there are countries that do that, right? So St. Kitts and Nevis has that kind of arrangement where Nevis can hold a referendum and become independent. The old Union of Burma, as it was from 1947 to the early 1960s, recognized the right of its states to secede at a time of their and in a way of their choosing. And that's the kind of thing which, if we were to try and reconstitute the state today, even if it were a union state, it could be a union state constitution that recognizes the claim of right and recognizes Scotland's right to independence. And I would be challenging Scottish unionists to say, what about that don't you want? Because if they don't want that, that must mean that their view of Scotland's place in the Union is not one that rests upon consent.
My sense of it would be that that's exactly the view they take.
Exactly, so get them on the record.
Well, I think they have gone on the record. I think they've said, we don't accept any of this. We don't want to discuss, we don't want to debate, we don't want to argue. We are simply saying to you that this sort of talk is unacceptable.
And that's a radical from established norm. That's my point. And that's the problem, right?
But the question is that what does that sort of attitude is that which characterizes the entire government apparatus in which could probably be in these circumstances?
Well, that's why 2000 is such a great opportunity, and that's why the 2004 is very difficult. When if you can't persuade people to go through an open door, how do you persuade them to knock one down that's bolted? I think the problem with a UDI approach is that it creates a sort of an unlawful basis for the state, and it's very hard to regain lawfulness and constitutional continuity after that. Yeah. What I would be focusing on is the Scottish government should, in any future coalition agreement at Westminster, any future confidence and supply agreement, there should be some commitment to a Scottish recognition of self-determination act or something like that. And if there were to be a UK constitution, then having that right of secession in it would be fundamental. Okay. But ultimately, these things come down to political will, right?
Of course. And then it's a question sorry to interrupt. We've just had a question come in from Periscope, Indy 2014. They're asking if you agree or not, if the Scottish government are going about Indy the right way, and if not, why? And you've got about 3 minutes to answer.
I think that the problem with the Scottish government's approach from really 2007 onwards is that they've seen this simply as about how to have and win a referendum. And this is not a referendum campaign. This is a state building process. So the independence referendum is not the end of the process. It is, in a sense, the start of the process. So what I would be looking at, or it's a midway point, what I would be looking at is how to build consensus around a Scottish constitution so that there can be agreement around what a Scottish state looks like, or agreement on what Scotland is willing to accept within the Union, including that the right of future independence should be recognised. So I would be much more in favour of an approach that started from constitution building, that tried to set up, for example, a provisional constituent assembly, to try and agree the nature of a Scottish state. This was done in the second devolution referendum. The hard work had been done by the Constitutional Convention. And that was quite a difference between the first and the second devolution referendums, is that in the first case, there wasn't really much agreement around what that would look like. In the second case, because people had been thinking about what that future arrangement would be, they were much more happy to vote for it. So I think that I think they should be supporting an initiative that's around constitution building and constituting the future Scottish state, rather than just winning the referendum.
That's very fascinating, and hopefully somebody from the Scottish Government is listening to this and they will want to come back and take this further, because it makes so much sense to me.
My father had a saying which was all ends into the middle. Yes. And I think that's what has to be done in these kind of different situations, right? So it's preparing for an independent state, but also if there is going to be a constitutional conversation south of the border, preparing to engage constructively in that conversation. Yeah,
that makes so much sense. See, Elliot, thank you very much.
Those parallel tracks.
Our time is almost up. A big thank you to you. Thank you for giving us so much of your time. It's been, as usual, it's been eloquent, and I hope people have learned a bit more about how constitutions affect our lives, our everyday lives, in fact. And a big thank you to everyone out there for joining us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the TNT show. We might have one or two technical difficulties along the way, but I hope that hasn't enjoyment. Oh yes, Elliot is showing you copies of his books on the Constitution. Rush out and buy a copy. Buy all three if you can. See, we've got a formidable list of guests lined up for future shows. We're hoping Michelle Thompson and Professor Joe Goldblatt will be able to join us soon. Don't miss that. Join us next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Please note, Wednesday, we're changing the dates. It's June, it's a new month. We're changing the date at which we do the show. It's a Wednesday, not a Tuesday, and it'll be another exciting show. I can absolutely guarantee it. In the meantime, do look out for Elliot's column, in the Constitution column in the Sunday National this weekend. Not to be missed. And more importantly, please support Indylive and Indylive.radio. These are new voices for a new Scotland and for all the news that you're not getting from elsewhere. And there's a whole bunch of stuff, as you well know, that you don't get on the regular channels. And you can help too. Join us by writing to the BBC, repeating my offer to give them a full hour on the TNT show to explain themselves. If I'm right, they'll probably ignore the invitation because they do not respect Scottish opinion, but I'd be delighted to be proved wrong. Get on their case. Thank you again, and good night. Join us next Wednesday. And remember, it's a great day for democracy. Take care. Good night.
This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
Indylive.radio.